All right, in this crash course, we're going to be learning everything about CSS positioning. We'll be talking about relative, absolute, fixed, and even the new sticky position. So come follow along, and I hope you learn something. CSS positioning is one of those CSS things that's been around for quite some time, but it's still in heavy use today. So it's a really excellent skill and really a necessity to learn if you're going to be working on the web. So don't forget to click the like and subscribe buttons down below, share this content so we can continue to keep these tutorials rolling. So we're going to jump right into the slides here to get the basics of CSS out of the way. Now, CSS positioning comes in 4 basic types. So static, you can see here, is the default. So all elements by default have a static CSS position. And then we have relative, we have absolute, we have fixed, and then last we have this new CSS position, which is called sticky. Now, sticky isn't supported in all web browsers 100%, so we'll look at that towards the end and I'll show you exactly where it is and isn't supported. Now, whenever you're using CSS positioning, you're always positioning your elements using these 4 keywords, either top, right, bottom, or left. So you're always moving an element based on its top, right, bottom, or left position. So these 4 keywords are what you'll actually use in the CSS. And you can use pixels, you can use ems, percentages, any CSS unit of measure will work, but you're always going to be working with these 4 CSS property names. So here's a quick little sample of what I mean by offset. Whenever you're working with CSS positioning, you're always offsetting from the keyword you use. So you can see here we're using the keyword top. And what that means is it's going to be offset or pushed away from the top edge based on your value over here. So you can see we're going to be using 100 pixels here. And if I was to declare this in CSS, this box would move down 100 pixels or offset or away from the top edge 100 pixels. So that's something very key to remember as we go through the rest of these slides, remembering that that value is an offset value. So let's go ahead and move over here and look at a couple of the values. You can see here that I've got positive values here on the insides, and then the negative values here are on the outsides. And what I mean by that are positive values will offset inward, and negative values will offset or push outward. So if you use a positive 100 value, assuming we're using the top keyword, it's going to push down or inward 100 pixels. If you use a negative value, it's going to push outward or up 100 pixels. Okay, so that's the way that those positive and negative values work in CSS. So let's take a look here at the relative position first. So relative CSS positioning is positioned according to itself. So its original position, that's where all of the movement is based off of. So in this little sample here, we're going to see that, let's assume we have a box here in our web browser, and we're going to assign the position of relative. You do this right in your CSS. And then we're going to say top 100 pixels. So again, try to think where you think this is going to move before I show you the example here. So again, it's going to be offset from the top edge. It's going to move in a positive direction because I'm using positive 100 pixels. So this would move down 100 pixels from its original position where it normally would have appeared in the document flow. That's where the box would now appear. Now in this second sample here, you can see that we've moved the top value to a negative 100 pixels. So again, think where you think this box is going to move. And you can see here in this instance, it's going to offset negative 100 from the top, where it's going to move up 100 pixels in this sample here. So one more sample here. In this sample, we're using 2 different keywords. So I'm setting both top to 100 and left to negative 100. So if we sort of imagine here from the top edge, it should move down in this direction 100 pixels, and from the left edge it should move negative or out 100 pixels. So I would expect this box to move in this behavior. So it's going to move left and down both. So you can use 2 keywords as well. Now you wouldn't ever want to use, let's say, top and bottom at the same time, because those are offsetting keywords, and you can't say like top 100 and bottom 100 because they're trying to push in opposite directions, and I'm pretty sure that would create a black hole in the universe. That's how those are actually created. So remember, you're always going to use top left or bottom right or something like that, not 2 opposing sides in your keywords. So let's go ahead and take a look here at a quick topic we need to understand, which is called the document flow. Now, whenever you're using CSS positioning, you are modifying the normal document flow of a document. So just as a quick refresher, tags come in several different varieties, but by default, a lot of the tags are what we call block level tags. So block level tags are like divs, paragraphs, lists over here, meaning they occupy an entire block of space. So these guys are taking up these entire horizontal lines. Even though this element down here is smaller than this, it's not going to go up and sit next to this guy because they're block, meaning they force each new element to be on its own block or line. So that's kind of what block level tags look like. Now the next set of tags is called inline tags. And inline tags are things like images, links, inputs, and inline tags are the opposite of block. They go, like 1, 2, 3, they all follow in the same horizontal line. And if there's not enough room, they simply just wrap down here to the next line and continue going. So that's the way inline elements work. Now I should note that this is just the default behavior of these tags. If I want an image tag to behave like a block, I can just change that in CSS and change any tags really between inline and inline block and all the various different types of display. So the basics are inline and block, and we have to understand that basic difference before we understand how CSS positioning modifies the document flow. So let's look at this example with relative positioning. So here we have 3 boxes. You can see that we're setting the top to 500 and left to -500. So we're going to take this box right here, and it is going to move down 500 and left -500. So it should appear somewhere over in here after this positioning context happens. So let's go ahead and animate this. So you can see, sure enough, that's where that box would reappear. But notice that these 2 boxes, 2 and 3, they don't move back up. There's just an empty space all the way up here where that element used to exist, if you will. And what we need to take away from this is that relative positioning does not remove elements from the document flow. So even though we visually move the element down here, as far as these other tags and all the rest of your HTML are concerned, it still exists right here. So they're still going to flow after that element as if it was still there. That's what we mean by document flow. So relative positioned elements do not modify the document flow visually. They just simply move visually and the other elements appear where they normally would. Okay, so that's with relative positioning. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how this works in absolute positioning. So absolute positioned elements are positioned differently than relative elements. They are positioned according to the nearest containing element. So they're not positioned according to themselves or their original position. They're positioned based on another element, the containing element or the nearest parent element that itself has a position. All right, so let's take a look at this element next. So in absolute positioning elements, you're always working with 2 elements. This inner element here is the element we're actually going to position. This outer element is what we're considering the parent element here. So there's always a parent element that comes into play with absolute positioning. So let's assume that the parent has a position of relative. Now we don't actually have to move the parent. As long as it's assigned a position, then that's all that matters. We can move it if we want, but it's not required. And then down here on our box, we're going to give this a position of absolute and top 100. So again, in this context, this box isn't going to move down from its own top edge. It's going to move down from the parent's top edge because the parent is the positioning context. So in this example here, we would expect this box to move down 100 pixels from this top edge right here of its parent. So in this case, if we were to move this box and animate this, it would actually visually move up, but that's because it's moving 100 pixels offset from the parent, okay? So that's how that works. Let's look at another sample here. So the same thing here, but now we're using 2 keywords. So this in case we're using bottom of 0 and right of 0. So whenever we say 0, we're saying move away from that edge 0 pixels. In other words, it's going to stick itself right on that edge. So in this case, what would happen is it would place itself right in the bottom right. So whenever you use a keyword of right, in absolute positioning, it uses the parent's right. So in other words, it uses the parent's right for the positioning context and the child's right edge as well. So in this case, we're saying right 0. So its right edge would be offset 0 pixels. In other words, stuck right on the edge. And then we're saying bottom 0. So the parent's bottom and the child's bottom are going to be offset 0 as well. So it sticks itself in the bottom right corner. All right, one more example here. This one with a negative value. So let's, again, see if you can think where this is going to move while I'm explaining here. So bottom 0, left negative 200. So again, it's the parent's element, so it's going to move 0 pixels away from the bottom. So I would expect it to get stuck down there. And then it's going to move left negative 200. So it's going to use the left edge of the parent, and it's going to move in a negative direction 200. So I would expect this guy, to kind of sit out here somewhere. So let's go ahead and animate this. And sure enough, it's going to move over that way in some direction. Now I'm just making up these. This obviously isn't to scale 100 and 200. But that's how that guy's going to move. Okay, lastly here with the 3 main types is what we call absolute positioning. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Lastly, we're going to be talking about document flow with absolute positioning because it's different. So you can see down here, there's a little cheat here for you. Elements in absolute positioning are removed from the document flow. So let's take a look here. So here we have a position of 500. So if I were to move this guy top 500 and left negative 500, remember this is from the parent. So it's going to move down from the parent 500 and it's going to move negative 500 over from the left. So, somewhere clear over here in your browser window. Now, because this guy moved and we're in absolute positioning, these 2 elements shift up. They're going to move up and occupy the space where that element used to exist. And that is because this element right here was removed from the document flow. So you can kind of think of this as far as divs 2 and 3 are concerned, div number 1 doesn't even exist. It's like it's not even there in the source code. They would just go up and occupy the space where they would normally be laid out. And that is because absolute positioning removes elements from the document flow. Now, the third type is fixed positioning. And fixed positioning is always fixed according to the viewport. So its positioning context is the browser window itself, which we refer to as the viewport. Now in fixed positioning, it works basically the exact same way absolute positioning works, except the parent element is always the viewport. So in this case, if we were to say top 100, right 100, this is going to move down 100 pixels from the top edge, and it's going to move this way 100 pixels from the right edge. So I would expect this, box to kind of sit over here. So again, as we animate this, right, it's going to move down 100, over 100, and that's where the element would be positioned. Another sample here, if I were to say right 0, bottom 0, then this element is going to move down to the bottom right behind my head here. So one important thing to remember with fixed positioning is that if you resize the browser window, it moves with the browser window and it will sit in front of all the other content. Now let's take a look at how this works in the document flow. So again, just like absolute positioning, fixed elements are removed from the document flow. So if I was to take this div here and position it down at the bottom left using fixed positioning, these other 2 elements would slide up and occupy the space where that element right here used to occupy, just like absolute positioning. Okay, the last one here is the sticky positioning context, and this one's a little bit goofy. It's fairly new, but its positioning context is the containing element. So it's kind of like absolute in this case, where it's the containing element, but only with certain conditions are met. Then it sort of behaves like fixed positioning. So it's kind of this weird hybrid between several. And you can see here, this is quoted from the MDN docs here, but it says it's treated as a relative positioned element until its containing block crosses a specific threshold. So that's what I mean by conditions. Once that threshold is set, it's treated as stuck. So it's kind of like fixed positioning at that point until meeting the opposite edge of its containing block. Now that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. The best way to understand sticky positioning, in my opinion, is just to look at an example. So with sticky positioning, it kind of works like this. So if I was to set the position to sticky and then set top to 0 pixels, this element right here we're assuming is the element that I'm actually positioning. What's going to happen is, assuming I have a scrolling context, so assuming I can scroll, so this would mean, right, this guy right here is set inside of something, and there's a scroll bar over here on the right side, and I'm scrolling up and down. Once this element right here gets to top, so this is this outer box here, is once it gets to top 0, then it behaves as a sticky element. So in this case, it would move up to top 0, so both elements would scroll up. Once this guy hits top 0, this guy becomes stuck, and the other content would then slide underneath it, and it stays in position like that. So that's the way sticky elements work. These are most often used for like sticky website headers, where the entire header you've probably seen, where you scroll down on a website and all of a sudden the header stays at the top of the browser window, but the website slides underneath it. That's a use case for using the sticky position. Okay, as far as the document flow is concerned, it behaves like relative until it's stuck, and then it behaves like fixed. So again, in this case, if I was scrolling, it gets stuck, and then all the stuff slides underneath it, and then it behaves like fixed. Okay, so the last thing we need to understand here before we look at some live code samples is z-index. Now, z-index controls the stacking order of CSS elements. So whenever you're moving things around and shifting things over one another, you're going to have some elements in front and some elements behind of other elements, right? And that creates a 3D plane or a z-index. So we can sort of shift which elements appear in front or behind of the other elements. So in this case right here, you can see that blue has a z-index of 3, green has a z-index of 1, and red has a z-index of 2. And it's pretty easy because the higher the number, that means it's going to be on top of other elements. So 3 is the highest, so it's going to be above that one. 1 is the lowest, so it's going to appear below, and then 2 is going to be in the middle. And that's pretty much how z-index works. Now in this next little sample here, you can see I've just switched the numbers. So here I have 1, 2, and 3. Since 3 is the highest here, it's going to sit in front of the rest, then this one, and then this one. And then on this one, we just sort of reversed them. So now this one is set to 1, this one's set to 2, and this one's set to 3, and this one sits in front of all the rest of them. It should be noted here in this slide that you don't have to do 1, 2, 3. You can do 1, 5, 50. And notice that this is a unitless number. It's not 50 pixels, it's just 50 as in a number. And I actually recommend you give yourself a bit of a gap. So you don't want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, because let's say later on I want to maybe put a div in the middle of all these. Well, if I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, I've got to shift all of the numbers in order to get that where I want it to go. So maybe better would be to use something like 5, 10, and 15. They're still going to stack properly, but then I have some extra numbers in between each of these if I want to, at a later date, set one to z-index 6 or something to have it be positioned just right. So that's the way z-index works. You can set that on any element you want to make things appear above and below other elements. So we're going to take a look at some live code here. But before we do that, I just want to give you one simple use case of maybe when you would want to use CSS positioning. So let's say here we have a website. I'm just going to sketch it really quick and hit my microphone here on my sketcher. I'm going to move this out of the road. Let's say we have a website that kind of looks like this, and maybe we have a header up at the top here, and then we have our content down here. And maybe I have a logo. So the logo of the element, right, traditionally sits right up here in the header, but maybe I want my cool logo to overlap these two sections. Well, you can't really do that with CSS unless you use CSS positioning. So in this case, what I could do is I could take my logo, remember my logo is going to be in a box, and I could use CSS positioning to move it down from the top edge of the header. So color is kind of bright. So in this case, right, I could set my logo up here, and I could say maybe set a position of relative, and I want to move it down from where it normally sits 200 pixels. So then it would actually appear right there visually. So that's how CSS positioning could be used. So let's jump over to our code editor and look at a couple of live samples of code here, and then we'll wrap up this tutorial. Okay, so here I am inside of Visual Studio Code, which I'm using for my code editor. And I'm going to show you just a couple quick samples that have to do with CSS positioning. Just want to quickly cover the HTML here. So you can see I've just got a simple div tag that's acting as my parent. That's the yellow box here. And I've got 3 children, a red, a blue, and a green. So I have a red, and blue, and a green. And I haven't applied any CSS positioning at all to these elements. This one right here is 500 by 500. Each of these little boxes are 100 by 100. So this is just the normal way this would lay out on a web page without any fancy positioning. So let's take a look at the CSS file here. You can see that the CSS file just has my parent and then all of the children here. So let's start out with relative CSS positioning. So I'm going to apply this to this middle box here, which is my blue box. I'm actually going to reposition these so we can have them in the same order, red, blue, green. There we go. So let's just apply here a position of relative. So you have to assign a position, and then I can say left 200 pixels. So this should move right 200 pixels. Now you can see here there's still a gap between 1 and 3 because relative positioning does not remove itself from the document flow. Now I can actually do a negative value as well. So I can do negative, and I'm going to do 50 pixels just so you can see you can actually offset out of bounds. So this is out, you can't see it, it's outside of the viewport area, but you can definitely move things out of bounds as well. Okay, let's now switch this. I'm going to move this back to left. Actually, we're going to go back to 200 pixels and save there. And now I'm going to switch the positioning context here to absolute. But remember, whenever you're working with absolute positioning, you need to come to the parent element and assign it a position as well. So I'm just going to make this guy relative. Now it's actually moved left 200 pixels from the left edge of the parent. Okay, so that's how that works. Now in this sample here, you really can't, there didn't look like a whole lot moved. But watch what happens when I switch this to a value like bottom. So let's actually undo this. So I'm going to go back to relative positioning, and instead of left, let's say bottom 50 pixels and save. So you can see in this example with relative positioning, it moves up from its own edge 50 pixels. But if I switch this, now if I go give my parent a position of relative, so I'm assigning my parent a position, and then I switch this position to absolute, it's now going to use the parent's bottom edge. So watch what happens when I save here. It now moves up 50 pixels from the bottom of the parent. And also notice that the green div now shifted up and occupies the space where that blue div used to occupy, because with absolute positioning, elements are removed from the document flow. All right, last here, let's go ahead and look at, last of the 3 anyway, let's go ahead and look at fixed positioning. So I'm going to take this blue guy and I'm going to set it to a position of fixed. Remember, fixed positioning always uses the viewport down here. So I'm going to set that to bottom 50, and let's set it to right 50 as well. So this will appear down here in the bottom right corner. You actually can't see it because of the way this works. So I'm going to turn on my inspect element and just go into responsive design mode here so we can see this. And then I'm going to scroll my viewport. It's clear down here. There we go. So this is simulating what would happen when a user resizes their browser window. And what I want to illustrate here is that this always will be away 50-50 from the bottom right corner of the browser window, regardless of how you resize it. It'll always float on top of other elements. So if I scroll the web page here, that's always going to be in view 100% of the time. It'll never not be in view because it's fixed positioned. So that's how fixed positioning works. And then let's do our third one, which is, or a fourth one, which is the sticky. And then we'll take a quick look at z-index. So in this case, let's go ahead and make, let's make our blue div. We're going to change this back to, well, not back to, but instead we're going to change it to sticky. And we're going to set it to top 0 pixels. Now, in order to see this work, I have to be able to scroll my content. So I have to have a scrolling area. So I'm going to make sure my parent element has an overflow of auto. That's going to make sure that it scrolls. I'm going to come over here to my CSS, and we're just going to do a bunch of Lorem Ipsum text here. So we'll just do a bunch of text, and then we will probably just copy this paragraph a bunch of times here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I don't know, lots of them, right? So that I'm able to have a scrolling context over here. Now watch what happens. So this is set to position sticky. So as soon as it hits the where did we set that? Right here. So as soon as it hits top of 0 pixels, right? That's when it becomes fixed or stuck to the top. So as I scroll down here, it's moving, it's moving, it's moving. Right at this point, it's now top 0, so it sticks there. And now everything else scrolls underneath it, and it will just stay there forever. So it's kind of like fixed and absolute combined, but only with that certain condition. You can actually do this on multiple elements here. So I can set my green div, I'll just copy here and paste down into my green one the exact same thing, and then refresh over here. Now the blue one will stick, and then the green one will also stick. So you can see I will scroll here and the blue sticks. Oops, did I? Oh, it's behind it. So this is actually kind of hard to see. Let's change this a little bit. So I'm gonna grab a couple of paragraphs. I'll just copy these out of here and paste them in between these two. There we go. Let's actually paste some in between this one too. This will be a little easier to see. Okay, now note here in my CSS that both the blue have a position of sticky and green has a position of sticky, both with top 0. So in this case, as I scroll, when the blue hits top 0, it gets stuck. Now everything's sliding underneath it. And when the green hits top 0, it's stuck, and then everything slides underneath it. So you can have multiple elements, and then you can sort of see they unstack in the same way if you just reverse the scroll. They scroll back out. So that's how position sticky works. So let's now just look at the z-index, and then we will be done. So I'll delete these paragraphs here so that we're just left with our 3 divs here. And let's just move these all with absolute positioning. So we're going to set the position to absolute. Whoops, spelled that incorrectly. Absolute on all of them. So we'll set that one to absolute. Red, green, and blue are all going to be absolute. And then let's move this one at, I don't know, maybe top 50 pixels and left 50 pixels. And I'm going to make each one of these offset themselves by 50 pixels. So this one down here is going to be 100 and 100. Whoops, I don't know what key I just did. And this one down here will be 150 and 150. Okay, so when I save here, you can see what I mean, where they're all overlapping one another. So let's say for some reason I want red to be on top of blue. Well, I can just come into red, and I can give it a z-index. I'm just going to pick a random number here of 50 and save, and you can see it now pops ahead. If I want blue to be on top of red, it just has to be anything above 50. So let's come back over to blue, and I can set this guy to have a z-index of 51, just to illustrate just one number higher will work. And now it pops back in front of red. And you can just change the order of any of those elements. Just make sure they have a higher number than the previous element, and they will pop in front. So that is everything you need to know about CSS positioning in about a 30-minute video. So I hope you learned a lot. Don't forget to thumbs up, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.